Hello. So, last time we talked about Romanticism, and today we are going to talk about 19th century realism. Okay, so if you look at my notes about this, I talk about how advances in technology in the 19th century reinforced some of the Enlightenment ideas and their faith in the connection between science and progress, how empiricism and positivism are widely embraced. Scientists and artists and the general public are all kind of on board with this new idea of positivism and how it sort of reinforces some of the earlier Enlightenment ideas. Auguste Comte is the guy who is kind of the positivism inventor, philosopher dude. And he believes that scientific laws govern the environment, right, that we live in, and should be revealed through careful observation and the recording of data. So this is a popular thought at the time, and it kind of leads into this interest in realism. So realism, what it sounds like is that it's like an attention to detail and an artistic genre that portrays things realistically as we see them. And that's part of it, but they also believe that only what they can see in the contemporary time with their own eyes was real, okay? So they don't think that things from the past or outside their own time can be realistically portrayed because you can't actually observe them. So even the romanticists who are portraying contemporary events like the raft of the Medusa, the artist wasn't there, he couldn't actually see that happening, so that isn't real enough for the realists, essentially. So they focus on subjects from their own time, not ancient history, and not fiction, and they work from models, okay? So one of the things to keep in mind while we talk about everything that we talk about in this class is that all art is contemporary art, okay? Art is always contemporary in the time that it's being made. So when we talk about contemporary art, we think about art that's made like since the 1970s when we're looking at it in terms of the history of art. But it's important to think that all of this work is being made by people in their own time, okay? So there's different kinds of art being made that overlap and have different viewpoints, like Romanticism and Realism, and one doesn't invalidate the other. There's different ideas and different things going on. And, you know, as our historians, we go back and we try to kind of group them all into movements that make sense so that we can talk about them and make some generalizations and organize them. But that's not how reality works when you're actually living it as an artist. So Romanticism and Realism were happening at the same time, and there's some overlap in themes and techniques. There are some artists that could kind of be cross-applied in both genres, but I try to kind of parse them out for you a little bit. Okay, so let's look at Gustav Courbet. He's kind of the leading figure of the realism movement. He lives from 1819 to 1877. He wasn't very into labels. He didn't really like the way critics and historians and people tried to categorize things. But he describes his own work as realism. So even he was on board with this particular label. He, like the other realists of his time, was very sincere about scrutinizing his environment. He painted the mundane and the trivial subjects that artists traditionally thought were unworthy of depicting. So, in most of the work that we've looked at up to this point, the subjects are important events in history, even if that history is recent or contemporary. They're important figures. They're noble figures, they're kings, they're queens, or they're figures from mythology, or they're religious figures. So everything that's depicted important enough to be the subject of a great artwork is something that has, it's something more esteemed in the public eye than just normal people, right? Courbet has a problem with this. So he basically, like, okay, if we think back to Caravaggio, remember Caravaggio in the Baroque in Italy, and how he portrayed holy figures, even Jesus, by using a model of common people in a tavern, and how that was kind of controversial at the time, that he had these kind of grudgy, like down-to-earth models standing in for holy, important people. Well, Courbet takes that a step further. He's like, we don't have to portray normal people under the guise of something holy or something more historically important. Ordinary people are worthy of being portrayed in artwork just as they are. So realists take that idea, they take that next step, and they just portray the actual people as themselves and say, this is not Venus, this is just a woman who lives on my street. So this elevates this low subject matter to the same level of importance as noblemen and as holy figures. So realists are interested in real people, working class laborers and peasants, anybody. They think that all of those stories are valid to be recorded and shared through the medium of painting or sculpture. So this seems like a totally normal thing, right? Like, to us now, it seems perfectly fine. You see portraits of normal people all the time. Maybe you have a portrait of yourself, or there's a portrait of your parents or grandparents in your house. But at the time, this is considered like bonkers crazy town. It's seen as an affront to the high standards of high art or fine art. The 1855 Exposition Universelle in Paris rejected 3 of Courbet's paintings that he submitted. He submitted 14 paintings. They rejected 3 of them. And they said it was because they were too large. This was one of the paintings that was rejected. But it was actually because they thought that his subject matter was socialistic. They had a problem with his subject matter and the way he was portraying these ordinary people. In response to that, he withdrew all of his work from their show. He was like, screw you, I'm not going to show any of my work with you. And he set up his own pavilion right outside the grounds of their show, and he called it the Pavilion of Realism. And one of his famous quotes about work and about realism is he says, I've never seen an angel. Show me an angel and I'll paint one. So he's very grounded in just things, portraying things he can see with his own eyes. Okay, so let's look at this painting. Burial at Ordonnance. So this depicts a funeral. It's a funeral in a very small town near his hometown. His hometown is Besançon in eastern France. And so this is a little town near where he grew up. This is a huge painting. It has the grand scale of a grand historical painting, but it depicts totally ordinary people in this bleak, ordinary eastern France landscape. And it's kind of imposingly anti-heroic, okay? So it does not make death seem noble. This isn't a martyred saint that we're looking at. It isn't a famous general on a battlefield. And it doesn't make the death seem romantic. It just seems like these are people, they look kind of sad, they're at a funeral, but no one's in like anguish. There's nothing super dramatic or theatrical going on. This is just a normal funeral. And he does not identify whose funeral it is, with the purpose that this is a specific funeral that he saw and attended, and the people who modeled for it are people he knew, and people from his family, his parents and his sisters are models for this, but he wanted it to be where it could be any funeral from any town. So basically, mundane reality instead of the heroic, instead of the sublime, instead of the dramatic, kind of exactly the opposite of romanticism, right? So this is kind of what he becomes known for, are these kind of works. So realists are also important because they change the goals of painting itself. The emphasis is no longer on illusion. Realists call attention to the painting as a pictorial construction. So they're not so much interested in making everything look glossy and three-dimensional and perfect and perfectly encyclopedically detailed and to make everything look very three-dimensional. They aren't really interested in the illusionistic qualities of painting. They're interested in what painting is in and of itself and recognizing that. So there's kind of a crudeness to these, right? Courbet uses his palette knife to paint with. That's not a thing that people were doing up until this point. Instead of just painting with brushes, he will layer in color with his palette knife to make these kind of looser, larger, less precise kind of strokes with the palette knife. The surface is quite rough. It's not all perfect and glossy like the neoclassical paintings that we look at. And this part of realism is the realism that in reality, this is a painting. It isn't what the painting is of. So it's kind of like, think back, if you ever read Plato's allegory of the cave, the shadows on the wall are not reality. So this is a painting. It isn't the real thing, right? Okay. So that's another layer of what the realists are interested in. Okay. I include Honoré Daumier for a few reasons. So he takes Courbet's ideas and he emphasized the political potential of realism. So he saw what Courbet was doing and he thought that that was valid and interesting, but he also thought that it needed to be more pointed. Not just ordinary people in any setting, but let's look at the plight of ordinary people. Let's look at what is happening to people in the lower classes and how they're being exploited and used. So he kind of pushes this a little more. This is an oil painting of his that is not finished. You can kind of see the undergrid marks on it. One of you is writing about his lithography, which is very important in terms of the development of the technique. His paintings, like this unfinished one, which is the third class carriage, are also important because of the subject matter. They shared subject matter with his works of lithography. By making lithographs of his work, he's able to spread it wider. He's able to get his work out to the people more easily. And that work was also imbued with his political commentary. So in this work, he kind of gives us a glimpse into the disinherited masses and what their day-to-day is like. And most of his work is this way. So he's taking these ideas from realism and kind of making them a little more pointed and really pushing them in his political agenda. Okay, Rosa Bonner. She's important. She was very famous in her time. She won the gold medal at the Salon of 1848. She then became the director of France's State Drawing School for Women, which was a big deal. She helped kind of make that have a good longevity in education. In 1865, she was the first woman awarded the Grand Cross of the French Legion of Honor, so she's very decorated and very respected. She believed and was pretty vocal that as a woman, an artist, and a lesbian, she had an important role to play in creating a new and more perfect society. She liked to wear men's clothes, which was not a thing that you saw very often from women at the time, and she basically used her position as this highly decorated, respected painter to draw attention to equality in society, in French society, basically. She was like, look at the things that I can do and accomplish, look at how I've been honored. I'm a woman, but I'm also an artist. I'm a lesbian, but I'm also an artist. So she was very interested in using her acclaim to kind of further some social justice issues in her time. In terms of her painting, she's very interested in portraying animals more than she's interested in people. And particularly, she was interested in portraying animals that are common in the French countryside. So one of the aspects of Romanticism and the interest in the Far East is we see paintings that have like tigers and leopards and these exotic kind of animals come into vogue. Well, one of Rosa's interest was showing kind of the majesty of the animals that are already living in France. So she did a lot of paintings like this one. In the Horse Fair, which is this painting, she uses kind of a loose brushwork and some dramatic lighting to capture the energy and the majesty of these horses. Okay, this is Edouard Manet. Manet is my favorite painter from this period, so I enjoy talking about him. If you're ever in New York and you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's a room that is totally dedicated to Manet. And it has, you look on every wall and you have all these different portraits that Manet did. They were a little earlier than this one. And it's very cool and kind of fun if you're in this room to really study these things and look at them. Because one of the things that he did when he was learning to paint is he used his siblings and friends as models, and he would make these kind of costumes just out of things around the house for them. So there's some of a matador, and there's some of a French woman, and all these things. And you can kind of follow this pink cloth from its different roles in these different costumes that he's created all the way around the room, and it's just super charming and kind of interesting to see a glimpse into his process. This painting is at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, which is a wonderful museum. If you're in Paris, you should go to the Musée d'Orsay. Okay, so Manet. He's born in 1832. He lives until 1883. He's extremely influential. In my mind, he's the first true, at least one of the first true modernist painters. So he really kind of paves the way as we're getting closer towards modernism. He's also interested in realism, but he's more interested in the industrialized Paris scene than in looking to kind of the country, which a lot of realists were more interested in. He is very influential also in the development of Impressionism and some of the techniques that go into that, which we'll talk about in the next module. This is Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. This is the lunch on the grass. And it's kind of an incredible painting. It's extremely controversial. It's one of the most controversial paintings ever painted for its time, which is kind of interesting. So let's look at this. We have two clothed men who are kind of in the peak of style for the time. And we have one clothed woman in the background. And then we have one totally nude woman in the foreground. For these models, one of these gentlemen is his brother. I believe it's the one that's looking at us. He's the brother of the artist. And the nude woman is Victorine Meurent. That's Manet's favorite model. We see her in quite a few of his famous works. The woman has tossed all her clothes onto the ground. She's not rendered in a super idealized way. She looks very real. She does not seem to be bothered by the fact that she's nude. She's looking right at us. She does not seem ashamed or concerned about her nakedness. And the gentlemen don't seem particularly disturbed by it either. She gazes directly at the viewer, but she doesn't really look like she's flirtatious. She doesn't also look shamed at all. The title tells us that they're at lunch, but no one is actually eating. The food is kind of off to the side. Maybe they've already eaten, but that's clearly not actually what's happening here. So this isn't truly a realist painting, right? Because the subject is odd and uncertain. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know what's happening here. We don't know the story. We don't know why she is naked. It's not showing us some plight of the downtrodden, ordinary people. So this painting is a painting that is about painting. He's making a study of the very nature of painting. The composition contains references and allusions to many different artistic genres: history painting, portraiture, nudes, pastoral scenes. We see all of that referenced here, but it isn't precisely any of those things. He's examining and maybe criticizing the history of painting since the Renaissance. No one is idealized. The setting is not idyllic. These are ordinary men in a park in Paris with a naked woman who the public then labels as very promiscuous. They have a problem with the fact that she is nude sitting with these two clothed people, and that she's nude and she appears to just be an ordinary woman. She's not Venus. There's no sort of guise put up over who she is meant to represent. His technique is also criticized in this painting because he has this kind of soft focus. It's not super precisely rendered. The lighting creates strong contrast between the light and shadow, but we don't have the sharpness of the lines that generally accompanies that kind of contrast. He, like the realist, is not interested in illusionism. He's not interested in that quality of painting. He's much more interested in painting and its properties as a medium. He's interested in the flatness of the surface, the flatness of the canvas, and he's not very interested in concealing that. So this is one of the most controversial paintings ever created because of the time it is portrayed. But if we look at it, it really is a painting that starts to look forward into the tradition of modernist painting and ideas about surface treatment and ideas about color blocking, ideas about brushstrokes, and just portrayal of subject matters in general, and making a painting about itself rather than being about some moment in history, rather than being about some contemporary issue, and rather than being about mythology. So it's really a groundbreaking work. Okay, this is another painting by Manet. This is Olympia. So this one is even more scandalous in some ways. It's loosely based on the Titian painting that we looked at last week, or 2 weeks ago rather, the Venus of Urbino, if you want to go back and take a peek at that. Here, okay, so when we were looking at classical nudes, they tend to be called Venus, right, or Aphrodite, because that's the goddess of love, so that makes it okay. We're portraying the goddess of love. Of course she's naked. And then last time in Romanticism, we looked at an odalisque, right? And I explained to you that an odalisque is a Turkish concubine, right? A member of a Turkish harem. So that makes it this Eastern, you know, this person from the Far East, this exotic thing. So that's kind of okay. But here, this painting is called Olympia, which at the time is a common professional name for sex workers in Paris. The model is Victorine Meurent, again, his favorite model. And she's looking directly at the viewer. So he's not pretending that this is a goddess. He's not pretending this is someone from an exotic other culture. He's saying, this is a sex worker in Paris, by titling it this. And she's looking right at you, and she's not ashamed. She looks a little bit defiant. So this, again, is very sensational. Her maid presents her with flowers, presumably from her client who is just in the room. The Paris Salon of 1865 did accept this painting, which is kind of shocking, and it horrified the viewers. The viewers and critics that came to the salon were very upset. But if he would have called it something like the Venus of Paris, it probably would have been fine. So it's an interesting thing. Like, he does it very purposefully to kind of shake people up a little bit. So she's not hidden in the guise of Venus. She's not a mythology. She has the audacity to be a sex worker and not appear to be ashamed of this. She looks defiant. And here we see that painting technique is again at the forefront of his studies. It's very emphasized here. We're looking at the way he emphasizes the surface. It seems to be kind of flat. We have these abrupt shifts in tonality. So it's all in all a very interesting painting, and it definitely is, again, looking forward to modernism. And it's kind of a different use of realism. So instead of using realism to elevate people, this is kind of elevating, but it's also kind of making fun of the presumptuousness of painting and what is acceptable subject matter of the time. Also, there's a black cat on the end of the bed, and I'm a sucker for a black cat. Okay, let's hop over to America. Winslow Homer, so he is born in 1836 and he dies in 1910. He is one of the leading American realists, and let's see, he lives in Boston. He experiences the main subject of his time, the big contemporary issue, which is, of course, the Civil War. He was a reporter and an artist and illustrator for Harper's Weekly, and he goes into the war on the Union side in that capacity as an artist and a reporter. So he sees all these things firsthand that are happening in the war and all the horrors of it. Here he's painting a veteran, as we can see both from the title and also from his outfit. He has his Union soldier pants and his canteen, his Union issue canteen on, but he is now post-war, and his post-war occupation is he is a farmer. So the message in this is to kind of praise the smooth transition from wartime to peacetime for a lot of these veterans, which was not the case with everybody, but it's kind of part of what some of the realists, particularly the Northern realists, were trying to portray. Unlike most realists, Homer does utilize symbolism in some of his paintings, including this one. So this painting is painted in 1865. I don't know how much you know about the history of farming, but in 1865, the kind of scythe a farmer would use was a cradle scythe, right? So that had it had like multiple prongs that were kind of strung together, and it looked different than this one. Okay, so this one looks like something that we think of the Grim Reaper as carrying, right? The single blade. So that's intentional. And the idea is that this is a painting that's showing us the transition to peacetime after war, but it's also kind of an elegy for all the fallen soldiers, right, on both sides. So it's this idea that it sort of symbolizes a veteran moving forward, but also he's kind of haunted or reminded of the Civil War and all the people who were lost. So realism, but we have a little bit of symbolism in it as well. Okay, this is another American. He's from Philadelphia, Thomas Eakins. So Thomas Eakins, he's born in 1844 and lives until 1916. So he's very interested in realism, and he is particularly interested in realism in what is maybe the most obvious capacity. So in using realism to portray contemporary events very realistically and with a lot of attention to detail. And he also is very interested in subject matter that he thinks goes along with realism, which is subject matter to do with scientific progress. So we have this painting, and he's kind of typical of American realists. So the American branch of realism can really be categorized as like these kind of a two-pronged idea. And the first is accurate depiction, accurate detailed depiction, and the second is this kind of quest for truth, this hunger for truth, and the truth in our actions and meaning for life. So this painting, which is called The Gross Clinic, it echoes and maybe reminds us of the Rembrandt painting we looked at that was the anatomy lesson by Dr. Tulp. Remember that portrait of all the surgery students watching their anatomy professor dissect a corpse? We looked at that a while ago. So this is Dr. Samuel Gross. He's a very renowned surgeon of the time, and he is in the operating theater at Jefferson Medical College. This painting actually hung there for like 130 years until the college sold it because they needed money. So he's lecturing, but he's lecturing while he's doing surgery on a live patient. So you can see his fingers are bloody, he's holding a scalpel, his students are all there. It's the 1800s, so no one is covering their face in any way, nor do they have gloves on. It's kind of terrifying to us looking back now. But this is kind of showing the height of medical technology at the time. So let's see, in 1846, that's when ideas about anesthesia are first introduced. So we can see we have our anesthetist is this guy with the very pronounced part in his hair who's holding a cloth over the surgery patient's face, because that's how an early anesthesia worked, right? You just kind of knocked someone out. And the surgery they're doing, the guy has a bone infection, so it sounds kind of terrible. They're doing something to remove the infection from the bone. It's very rough. You can see all the surgical implements. The mother of the patient, for some reason, is in the painting. She's the woman to the side there with her face covered. I don't know why you would have her right there. Okay, so this is a painting that's applauding empiricism and scientific progress, and that's part of a lot of what Thomas Eakins used realism for, right? Okay, so this is a student of Thomas Eakins. This is Henry Asawa Tanner. He is born in 1859 and lives until 1937. So he's a student of Eakins. He studies at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. This is before he moves to Paris in 1861, where he stays. He was African American, and though he was in the North and had opportunities like going to study college and things, it was difficult being a person of color in America. So he moves to Paris, where he views the work of other realists at the time. So he kind of combines Eakins' interest in detail and this French interest in portraying the dignity of ordinary people. So Eakins really, like I said, was interested in portraying people who were scientists or were doctors or were doing things in some kind of important capacity. And Tanner gets much more interested in portraying just normal people in their homes or their places of work doing normal things. He then later in his career uses these kind of models to portray narrative scenes from the Bible. So he kind of takes like a Caravaggio type twist where he's using ordinary people in ordinary settings to make kind of a contemporary version, a contemporary translation of biblical scenes. This is not one of those paintings. So this one is just two people, a grandfather and his grandson sitting in their kitchen at the table praying before they eat. It's called The Thankful Poor. So the detail of the figures and the objects contrasts with the treatment of the background of the scene in general. So we have a lot of detail in some areas, and then we have this very expressive loose brushwork, right? We also have non-local color, particularly if you look in the sleeves of the grandfather and the tablecloth. So this flirtation with the loose kind of quick brushstroke and non-local color is a direct lead-in to Impressionism. So as we look at some of these works in realism, we start seeing that the painters are also very interested in the act of painting and in what can be done when you stop worrying about the illusionistic qualities of making things look absolutely realistic. So we start getting into more expressive painting modes, and Henry Asawa Tanner is one of the earlier people to do that. Okay. Kind of have to mention John Singer Sargent. He's quite a famous painter from this time. This painting always reminds me of, if anyone's familiar with the photographer Julie Blackman. She's a local photographer, but she's become quite famous. If you Google her work, Julie Blackman, this painting always reminds me of her. Anyway, okay, so John Singer Sargent, he's born in Florence to expat American parents. He studies art in Paris, and then he moves to London. Basically, he isn't doing anything all that different from a lot of the people that we've already looked at. So his light brush strokes kind of remind me of Velázquez. He's doing some similar things to Manet in regard of being interested in painting and its relation to the surface. We see these broader strokes, this use of a palette knife. So we're seeing some of these painting techniques that have come up in the other realists. The thing that I like about this painting is the way the people look. The children just look kind of spontaneous, right? It doesn't look superposed. Like this is just where they happen to be. It was almost like he took a quick snapshot of this. And there's something about that that seems more real than portraiture, which is very carefully orchestrated and posed, and everyone is looking very prim and proper. Like these just look like kids in their house. And there's something about that that gives us this glimpse into these people's lives that does kind of go with this idea of realism and the idea that this is more real than some of the very sort of artificially posed portraiture that we've seen in the past. Okay. So again, this is art. This idea that the artist's job, according to realists, is to record contemporary people in their contemporary natural settings, not to contrive and not to pose. So this is the kind of realist idea that he's getting at here. All right, the last work that we're going to look at is this one. This is by Ammonia Lewis. She's born in 1844 and lives until 1911. She's American. She's the daughter of a Chippewa woman and an African-American man. She attends Oberlin College, which is the first American college to grant degrees to women, and it's one of the first American colleges to accept African-Americans. So she takes advantage of this opportunity. She wants to study. She knows she wants to be a sculptor, and so she goes and finds this school where she can study and do that. In 1865, she moves to Rome. It was supposed to just be a trip, but she ends up liking it there better than she liked being in America, so she stays there. She lives there for the rest of her life. She's quite successful, which is a real testament because it was hard to make a living as a woman artist at this time, and as a woman artist of color, it's even more difficult. So to raise the money to move to Rome, She makes most of her money by making these portrait medallions, a lot of them of abolitionist leaders. She also makes marble busts, so she does like the marble bust portraiture of different people of note and sells them, and that's how she makes her living for the rest of her life. Her style is kind of more reminiscent of neoclassicism, right? It looks a little more like a neoclassicism kind of throwback in terms of style, but her subject matter is often more in keeping with contemporary realist themes, particularly in this sculpture. One of you is writing about one of her other more historically based works that has a little more in common with neoclassicism than this work. This is called Forever Free. The phrase Forever Free comes from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, both the first version and the final version of it. And this was meant to represent freed slaves the morning after the Emancipation Proclamation freed them, which we all know, looking back at history, that many slaves were not actually freed until 2.5 years later on Juneteenth. If you don't know about that, I recommend you check it out. But basically, this is to show that moment of freedom. You can see the broken shackles on the man's hand. Some art historians argue that that is too simplistic of a reading of this, and that it's not only a comment on kind of a celebration of the freedom of African Americans after the Emancipation Proclamation, but that it's also a criticism of the lingering gender inequality in America. So she actually makes this in Rome, but she makes it in tribute to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But the man is standing, and the woman is portrayed as much smaller than him in terms of scale, and she's kneeling, right? And so a lot of art historians think that this is because once men, African-American men, were freed, they were able to vote. In theory, there were a lot of terrible actions done to suppress the vote. But women of any color, no women were allowed to vote in America until 1920. So that's quite a long time later. So some people think that this is kind of a celebration of freedom while also showing that people are still not all equal and that women still are kind of lower down the totem pole and cannot vote yet. So some people think that that was intentional. Other people argue that it wasn't, that it's just someone who's kneeling and praying and being grateful that they're free. So it's an interesting sculpture. It is carved out of marble. Almost all of her work is done in marble. That is her medium of choice. So, all right, realism. So we've talked about romanticism, we've talked about realism. The next thing that we're going to talk about that was another huge artistic development is kind of a pun here, in the 1800s is early photography. So the next thing we'll talk about is early photography. Definitely take a peek at the Romanticism lecture and the slides for that as well. All right.